Such a fierce little thing she is. They say she has no need of comfort. They are wrong in that, I fear. All men need comfort. Sets and Bar on Saera Targaryen. Fire and Blood, The Long Reign, Jaehaerys and Alysanne. Policy, Progeny and Pain. The story of Saera Targaryen is one of the most compelling parts of Fire and Blood, and has rightly become a fan favourite part of the story. Not only is Saera herself an interesting character, very different from any Targaryen princess we've seen before, she also represents one of the black marks on the reign of King Jaehaerys I Targaryen, Jaehaerys the Conciliator, who is often named as the best king Westeros ever saw. But it runs a lot deeper than that, because Saera Targaryen really helped show us as readers how George R. R. Martin approaches and created his world lore in Fire and Blood, and demonstrates his ability to tell us a story without actually telling us, with the reader really having to remember the context of Fire and Blood and reading between the lines of the narrative that's being presented to us. Because when you take some time to do this and look at the story of Saera Targaryen through this lens, you realise it may very well be extremely different than it first appears in text. A tragic and dark tale with some quite horrific implications that aren't really apparent at first. It's important we briefly go over the story of Saera Targaryen as presented in Fire and Blood, as it really helps us not only understand why she became a fan favourite, but why there's a lot more to her story than meets the eye. Saera was the 10th born child and 5th born daughter of King Jaehaerys Targaryen and good Queen Alysanne, born in 67 AC. It is said that she was always a difficult child, and throughout her early years she caused mayhem around the Red Keep, locking her sister Daela, whom was scared of cats, in a room with kittens, and hiding bees in her chamber pot. One time she is said to have dyed the Kingsguard cloaks pink, and would often be seen stealing food from the kitchens, with that quickly turning into wine by the age of 11. After she turned 12, she was often found drunk, sometimes even in the sept of the Red Keep. Her pranks were particularly cruel towards the court fool Tom Turnip, with the fool often ending up badly hurt as a result. She also treated her handmaids and scepters poorly, with her having a total of 12 in total before she was 12 years of age. By the age of 13, she had become quite taken by the men at court, and she declared to all she would become a queen, proposing to her father she marry the Prince of Dawn, or the King Beyond the Wall, and even a prince visiting from the Summer Islands. 2 years later, when she was 15, however, she had come to entertain other fantasies. She realised that if she stayed at home in the Red Keep, rather than being married off, she could have as many young men, squires, knights and lords as she liked. She quickly had 3 favourites of all the men who attended her at court: Jonah Mooton, the heir to Maidenpool, Roy Connington, the Lord of Griffin's Roost, and Braxton Beesbury, the heir to Honeyholt. She was also close friends with 2 girls of her own age, Perianne Moore and Alice Turnbury, both of whom became her closest friends. For more than a year, the 3 girls and the young lords did everything together. At first it seems that King Jaehaerys considered all 3 of Saera's male favourites promising when considering a future husband for her. Queen Alysanne, however, did not agree, and spoke of her doubts on Saera's companions, especially Braxton Beesbury. Jaehaerys waved her concerns away, claiming that Saera had never been alone with any of the men, and she was always attended by her servants, and thus could not possibly get herself into trouble. It would turn out that Queen Alysanne's instincts were indeed correct. In 84 AC, when Saera was 17 years of age, 2 men from the City Watch found Tom Turnip with whores at the Blue Pearl, where Mooton, Connington and Beesbury were amongst the patrons. Mooton admitted the joke had been Saera's idea. The 3 lordlings were then brought to King Jaehaerys. When none of the 3 men dared to say a word about Saera, they were thrown into the black cells. Queen Alysanne then called Saera's 2 friends, Perianne Moore and Alice Turnbury, to be questioned. The 2 girls quickly revealed that all 3 had practiced kissing, dressed at first, naked later on. When the girls dared each other to kiss a real boy, Saera had proclaimed she would kiss a man, which is where her 3 male favourites come in. According to Perianne, it was Braxton Beesbury who did the training for all of them. When asked where the servants had been during all of this, the two girls informed Alysanne they had simply ordered them to stay outside. Jaehaerys next called Saera to him as he sat at the Iron Throne, after which Alysanne informed her they were aware of everything that had happened and that Alyce Turnberry was pregnant. When then informed of the imprisonment of her 3 favourite lordlings, Saera began to speak, and within the span of an hour went from denial to dismissal to quabbling to contrition to accusations to justify her defiance. Jaehaerys frankly asked her whether she had given her maidenhead to any of the 3 men, to which Saera proclaimed that all 3 believed that they had been the first, saying that boys were such silly fools. Saera declared she would be married, but that she could not decide which one of the 3 would be the best choice. When she suggested marrying all 3 of them, comparing herself to Aegon the Conqueror and, foolishly, to Maegor the Cruel, something that sparked her father's anger, given his own personal history with Maegor. The enraged Jaehaerys had her confined to her bedchamber. The king and the queen discussed what was to be done with Saera and her friends. Jaehaerys was furious and ashamed, and said more than once that Saera was no longer his daughter. While Alysanne agreed that Saera needed to be punished, and harshly, she moved Jaehaerys by telling him that if he had been able to reconcile with the lords who had fought against him and his family during the reign of King Maegor, he could reconcile with Saera as well. It's believed Jaehaerys might have been willing to forgive his daughter, had she done simply as she was told. But Saera escaped her confinement that very night, and attempted to enter the dragon pit, with the intentions of taking a dragon, only to be caught by a dragon keeper. Enraged by this, Jaehaerys had her confined to a tower cell, where she was guarded by Jonquil Drake, Queen Alysanne's personal sworn shield. Saera's 5 companions in crime were dealt with. Beesbury requested a trial by combat, in which he foolishly faced King Jaehaerys himself. Saera was forced to watch from the window of her tower cell, while her father slew her lover. Saera was sent to Oldtown, and given to the faith a fortnight later. At Oldtown, her sister, Seta Maegella, took charge of her instruction. It was announced that Saera would become a novice with the Silent Sisters. It is believed at the time Jaehaerys only meant this sentence to be a lesson, that he felt a year or 2 of silent prayer and harsh discipline, and contemplation of her actions would be good for Saera and set her on the path to redemption, that he did not intend for her to actually join the faith as a scepter. Saera, however, did not care for her father's plan. For a year and a half, she endured the cold baths, rough-spun robes, meatless meals, having her head shaved and scrubbed with horsehair brushes, and being caned when she was disobedient. In 85 AC, she fled the mother house during the night, knocking down an old Silent Sister during her escape. Lord Hightower's men searched every house in Oldtown for her, but found no trace. Rather than hiding in Westeros, Saera managed to find passage on a ship out of Oldtown, which brought her to Lys. To this day, Lys remains a feast for the senses, a balm for the soul. Its pillar houses are famed throughout all of the world, and sunsets here are said to be more beautiful than anywhere else on Earth. The writings of Yandel, the world of ice and fire, the free cities, the quarrelsome daughters. She took service at a pleasure garden, still clad as a novice of the faith, pretending to be a god-sworn maiden for the patrons to despoil. This news reached the court of Jaehaerys half a year after Saera's escape from Oldtown. Alysanne wept, saying the Lyseni turned Saera into a whore. Jaehaerys proclaimed that she'd always been one. After Saera's betrayal and abandonment, it was said that King Jaehaerys was never again the same as he had been before. He forbade Alysanne from keeping in contact with Saera, with the queen defying him, hiring agents to keep watch over her. Following the death of 3 of Saera's sisters, Alyssa, Daela and Visera, within the span of 5 years, Queen Alysanne begged Jaehaerys to bring Saera home, only for Jaehaerys to refuse to do so, declaring he did not want to hear her name again, and discouraged Alysanne from going to Lys herself. Alysanne would write to Saera every now and then, although Saera would never reply to her. Saera, infamous but wealthy, left Lys for Volantis a few years before 99 AC, where she became the proprietor of a famous pleasure house. When her father called the Great Council in 101 AC to settle the matter of his succession, 3 bastard sons of Saera, each fathered by a different man, one by the Triarch of Volantis, came to press their claims. Saera herself, though only 34, decided not to press her own claim, boasting she had her own kingdom in Volantis. One of her bastard sons was said to be the very image of Jaehaerys as a boy. When you take the story of Saera Targaryen as presented by Fire and Blood, it tells the tale of a young, defiant, and fairly independent young woman, rebellious, acting in a way most princesses never would dare to. But at the same time, while she can be those things, she clearly, from her actions, had a very reckless streak within her, with little regard to what happened to her peers or the wider impact of her actions. Saera has become a popular fan favourite character due to this perception of her pushing back against the archaic and oppressive regime of nobility and being a fifth-born daughter, and her place within it. And while this story, technically yes, is all those things, the way Fire and Blood writes about the deeds of Saera Targaryen is done so in a way that is providing the reader a warning of the fate of those who rebel against established societal conventions in the view of the establishment. But there is one huge key detail about this story that a lot of fans have latched onto that I think it could be possible George R. R. Martin omitted that could completely change the tone of Saera's story. There are 2 elements that, if you do actually stop to think about it, do leave a slight hole in the Fire and Blood narrative. Firstly, how Saera found passage to Lys, and then the nature of what the pleasure garden actually is. When we break this down, it does kind of make Alysanne's desperate reaction to her daughter's fate even more justified. So, how did Saera travel from Oldtown to Lys, and why specifically Lys, when she had the whole of Essos at her feet? Well, she really didn't have time to be picky about where she ended up. She needed to get out of Oldtown quickly. Oldtown is one of the major ports of Westeros, getting trade from all around the known world. There would have been countless ships for Saera to have chosen from, but in Oldtown there is a stronger possibility than elsewhere in the Seven Kingdoms of Lys being a ship's destination. While Lys isn't the only free city south of the Stepstones, trade from Lys and Volantis tends to favour ports like Oldtown, historically, given how unsafe the Stepstones have been, be that pirate-controlled or a war zone between the other free cities, and sometimes even Westeros. Choosing Oldtown means they can avoid passing the Stepstones and still trade with the Seven Kingdoms. So odds are, if you find passage on a merchant ship in Oldtown, it will be going to one of these locations. So it's no surprise that Saera found herself in Lys. The other question is, how did Saera pay for her passage, as it seems very unlikely a captain would have taken her for free. She would have needed to pay her way. From discussions between Jaehaerys and Alysanne, it does seem that Saera didn't have access to money, given she was living as a novice. So sadly, I suspect Jaehaerys' suggestion that she paid her way using her body is likely close to the truth, and really the only viable way I can see it playing out. There's also a fan theory that maybe the captain had ulterior motives and allowed her to initially travel for free. Motives that may indeed make Saera's fate a lot darker than the narrative in Fire and Blood suggests to us. There was never a slave who did not choose to be a slave. Their choice may be between bondage and death, but the choice is always there. Thoughts of Tyrion Lannister, A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 66, Tyrion 12. Lys is a slave city. 1 in every 3 people in Lys a slave. The city is most famous for its bed slaves, with many young women, girls and boys sent there for training, with the Lyseni in particular known to be famously persistent in their search for comely young boys and fair maids for their pillow houses. The theory goes this ship captain is approached by the unknown beauty who was Saera, who was desperate to flee Oldtown, allowing her passage with the intent of selling her into slavery once they reach Lys. Additionally, this does lead to the question, did the captain really know who Saera was? Because frankly, he would have been mad to have intentionally sold a Targaryen princess into slavery. That is, unless the financial gain is so great it was worth the risk. So we know, by whatever means, Saera reached Lys, and soon found work in a pleasure garden, with the narrative presented in the book that it was 100% solely her choice, implying that this was really the only marketable skill she had to live an independent life. What this fan theory suggests is none of this was willing on Saera's part, and she was in fact sold as a bed slave. Now, there does seem to be a distinction between a pleasure garden and your run-of-the-mill common pillow house or brothel. They are definitely marketed as a more upmarket establishment, but even then, I guess not every garden is made equal. All I can say is that some of the text in the main book series that describes life in the pleasure garden isn't exactly painting a lovely picture, as typically, while these women are often treated much better than your average whore, many are still slaves and not necessarily there of their own volition. In the Dragon Tamer chapters in A Dance with Dragons, we hear Quentyn Martell being told about girls in the pleasure garden in Meereen who are left out in the rain all night if they're not picked by customers. You can also point towards Alysanne's reaction to finding out her daughter was working in a pleasure garden. She was distressed enough that she and Jaehaerys were separated for the best part of 2 years, over his reluctance to bring her home. Some fans believe this was her true reaction to finding out her daughter was sold as a bed slave. Maybe a bit reaching, but I get the logic behind this. So there's definitely a chance the fate of Saera was a lot more tragic than actually meets the eye, and I can see the line of logic used to construct the idea that Saera was sold in lease as a bed slave by the ship captain who brought her there from Oldtown. I do like how it challenges the established narrative in Fire and Blood, and I can see some room for it to work, but there are a few gleaming issues that make me very hesitant to view this as more than just an interesting idea. There are some elements of Saera's wider fate and story that don't really line up with the idea of her being a bed slave. We know eventually she became powerful and rich enough to relocate to Volantis and set up her own now world-famous pillow house. Not something a bed slave, even a Targaryen one, would be able to do if they're effectively a slave, unless she was somehow freed or managed to buy her own freedom. Now, it's established at the Great Council of 101 that Saera had 3 bastard sons who were seemingly raised by their mother. Again, given what we know about bed slaves in Essos, it's highly unlikely if she was a slave she would have been able to raise her sons, who in turn would likely have been sold into slavery themselves. Brothels are a much sounder investment than ships, I've found. Whores seldom sink, and when they are boarded by pirates, why, the pirates pay good coin like everybody else. Peter Baelish to Eddard Stark, A Game of Thrones Chapter 27, Eddard 6. But I think the biggest smoking gun that leaves a huge hole in this theory is that Saera is always described specifically as a courtesan, which, while is still a sex worker, is very different from your average prostitute or bed slave. These women are often highborn and hold a significant amount of power both socially and politically, with their clients mostly being the rich and powerful of the city, with the courtesan often choosing the client than the client choosing the courtesan. But there is actually precedent for the idea that Saera could have been a slave who turned into a courtesan, even if we don't know the specific mechanisms to allow her to do so. We do know of one other highborn Westerosi woman who was sold as a bed slave in Lys. In 96 AC, Joanna Swan was captured by pirates in the Stepstones and sold as a bed slave in the free city of Lys, with her eventually becoming a rich and powerful courtesan known as the Black Swan, which does kind of prove the idea that you can still be sold into slavery and become a courtesan. But given all the freedom Saera was given compared to your average Lyseni sex worker, keeping her children, apparently keeping her earnings, or at least a share enough to be able to afford to relocate to Volantis, and of course, her mother was in contact with her to some degree, and even had agents following her making sure she was okay, which all points to the fate that befell Saera was of her own choosing. But what the story of Joanna Swan might tell us is that it still may be possible for elements of both the official narrative presented in Fire and Blood and this theory to be true in some degree. There's a lot of compelling ideas that make up this theory, that Saera was sold as a bed slave, rather than willingly becoming one, that do fill a lot of holes we have in the narrative. But there are just as many things that don't fit at all, given the information we know is 100% likely true. Certain elements of this theory could work with the current narrative, as presented in the books. I personally do like the idea of the merchant who brought Saera to Lys originally having the intention of selling her as a slave. However, perhaps when she got to Lys and people realised who she might be, the merchant abandoned this plan to escape any of the repercussions of his involvement in Saera's escape, with Saera then freely choosing to become a courtesan. There's very much this idea that Fire and Blood is this book made up of unreliable propaganda, an idea I dislike immensely. and an idea that's only been propagated further by House Targaryen showrunners frequently referring to the book as that whenever they decide to make a change from the book in the show. The trouble is, while there certainly is propaganda and unreliable information in Fire and Blood, with a lot left to the reader to determine for themselves, much more of it is verifiable fact. Various sources that corroborate each other. However, there is a small section of the fanbase who deeply dislike King Jaehaerys and believe the history of his reign has been heavily sanitized to protect his image of benevolence, competence, and being the best king Westeros ever saw. The idea is when history was set out in Fire and Blood, there was careful consideration to protect the legacy of Jaehaerys, and thus the actions of Saera Targaryen were turned into her willingly running away from home rather than being sold into slavery due to her father's banishment of her. So the idea is the Maesters constructed this clean, sanitized image of Jaehaerys at the expense of Saera. Here's the inherent flaw with this argument though. Jaehaerys' image doesn't need to be sanitized. As personally, I believe Fire and Blood already paints him clearly as, on balance, a good king who was a very questionable father to his children, especially those born later in his life, most of all, the girls. I could write a whole video about how shitty of a job he did with his daughters, and in fact, I might very well do that. I think Jaehaerys was really in a catch-22 situation with Saera. I can't see a way this situation could have played out, with everyone walking away happy with the end result. What's easily forgotten is this wasn't just about Saera's promiscuity. If it was just about that, I think Jaehaerys would have given her much of a less severe punishment, and quickly just married her off. At the end of the day, she tried to steal a dragon, which if you know the fate of Sarea Targaryen is a huge problem. She even had the gall to compare herself to Maegor the Cruel, knowing the kind of figure he was to Jaehaerys' childhood. Jaehaerys had to punish Saera, but if he did so too lightly, she would just do it again. If it were too harsh, it pushes her to rebel harder. In this case, given the severity of her actions, I can see why it came across that Jaehaerys punished Saera too severely, and did push her down a more rebellious path that led her to Lys. I enjoy this theory because it explains nicely what is established in Fire and Blood and tries to fill in the gaps in a way that makes sense. The idea Saera was sold into slavery and Fire and Blood is trying to protect Jaehaerys' reputation by making it all Saera's own will is compelling, but there is a lot of it that doesn't fit, and like a lot of Fire and Blood theories, they're putting a lot of square pegs in round holes. But the thing is, we don't actually know what the shape of the hole is to begin with because of the way Fire and Blood is written. But to me, what this theory highlights most of all is the way in which George R. R. Martin has used the history book format of Fire and Blood to curate the wonderful characters and unique stories, but left the reader room to fill in the blanks with their own ideas and interpretations, which allows for theories like this to be crafted.